London has a way of swallowing its own history. Walk down the Old Witch today, past the curved sweep of grand Edwardian buildings, past Australia House with its bronze statues and Portland stone, and you'd never guess what used to stand here. Never guess that beneath your feet, paved over and forgotten, lies the ghost of one of London's most dangerous, most colourful, most strangely alive neighbourhoods. Here's what it was like to survive Wych Street in the late 1700s. Wherever you're listening from tonight, I'd love to know. Drop a comment with your corner of the world and what time it is there. And if you enjoy drifting off to stories of forgotten places, a subscribe would mean a lot. But for now, just settle in. Sink a little deeper into your pillow. Pull the covers up. Because where you're going, there are no clean sheets, no warm beds, no comfort at all, really. Just survival. The year is 1783. You're 14 years old, and you've just arrived in London. Not by choice, exactly. Your father died last winter. Consumption. The village couldn't support another mouth without a man's wages attached. So your mother did what thousands of mothers did in Georgian England. She found you an apprenticeship. 7 years of labour in exchange for a trade, a bed, and enough food to keep you breathing. The coach drops you at the Strand. You've never seen so many people in your life. Back home, everyone knew everyone. Here, thousands of faces rush past without a single glance in your direction. Carts rattle over cobblestones. Sellers cry their wares. Somewhere nearby, a man is shouting about the end of days, while another is loudly haggling over the price of eels. The smell hits you before anything else. Not one smell. Hundreds of them, layered and competing. Horse dung, obviously. The streets are thick with it, but underneath that, something sweeter and more rotten. Open sewers running down the middle of lanes, cesspits beneath houses seeping through brick and mortar, the acrid bite of coal smoke hanging in the air like fog, and people. Thousands upon thousands of unwashed bodies pressed together in a city that barely has room to breathe. Your eyes water. Your stomach lurches. Welcome to London. The address your mother wrote on that scrap of paper leads you off the Strand, past a church called St. Clement Danes, and into a narrow lane that seems to swallow the light. This is Wych Street, and even by London standards, it's something else. The buildings lean over you, actually lean, their upper floors jutting out so far they nearly touch across the street. These are Elizabethan houses, some of them 200 years old, built when nobody cared about things like building codes or structural integrity. Their timber frames have warped and settled, their plaster has cracked and fallen away. Their windows are clouded with generations of grime, but they're still standing, somehow, crammed with life. You find the carpenter's shop about halfway down. A weathered sign creaks in the breeze, barely readable. The door is propped open despite the cold, and inside, a man is bent over a workbench, shaving curls of wood with a plane. He doesn't look up when you enter. You the boy? You confirm you're the boy. He sets down his plane, studies you for a long moment. He's maybe 40, which makes him old by the standards of this neighbourhood. His hands are scarred and calloused. His apron is stiff with wood dust and what might be dried blood from a slip of the chisel. Show me your hands. You hold them out. He turns them over, examines your fingers, your palms, the strength of your grip. Soft, he says. Village soft. We'll fix that. And just like that, your new life begins. The workshop sits on the ground floor. Above it, 2 cramped rooms where the master carpenter lives with his wife and 3 surviving children. The other 4 are in the churchyard. Fever took them. It's just something that happens here. Your sleeping space is in the workshop itself. A pallet of straw in the corner, covered with a blanket that might once have been wool, but has been worn down to something thin and scratchy. At night, you share this space with the other apprentice, a boy named Will, who's been here 3 years already. Will gives you the lay of the land that first night. Don't go out after dark. Not alone. Not ever. Why not? He just looks at you, like you've asked why fire is hot.
The footpads will have your throat cut before you can scream. And even if they don't, the watch might take you for a thief and throw you in Newgate anyway. Better to stay inside. Keep your head down. Footpads, you learn, are what they call muggers here. The narrow streets and dark alleys make perfect hunting grounds. The overhanging buildings create shadows within shadows. A man could step out of a doorway, stick a knife in your ribs, strip you of anything valuable, and vanish into one of 100 winding passages before anyone even heard you fall. What about the watch? Will laughs. Not a pleasant sound. The watch is useless. Half of them are drunk. The other half are in on it. You're beginning to understand that you haven't just come to London. You've come to a particular kind of London, a London that exists in the cracks and shadows. A London that the grand houses on the Strand pretend doesn't exist, even though it's right behind them. Wych Street is the spine of this world, and Holywell Street, running parallel just to the left, is its beating heart. On your second day, the master sends you to fetch some supplies. Nails, he says, the ironmonger on Holywell Street, and for God's sake, come straight back. You step outside into the morning chaos. Wych Street is narrow, maybe 12 feet wide at its widest point, sometimes less. The buildings crowding in on both sides make it feel like a canyon filled with people, costermongers pushing carts of vegetables, hawkers selling everything from pins to puppies, a man with a dancing bear on a chain, collecting pennies from open-mouthed children, an old woman squatting in a doorway, selling sprigs of lavender that do absolutely nothing to cover the smell. You push through the crowd. Turn onto Holywell Street. It's even darker here. The buildings hang so far over the road that barely any light reaches the ground. But the shadows are alive with commerce. Shop after shop crammed into every available inch. Old clothes shops mostly. The Jewish traders who've made this their quarter, selling second-hand coats and breeches to anyone with a few coins. Further down, the bookshops. Now, these bookshops are interesting. Some of them sell what you'd expect: religious pamphlets, political tracts, the occasional novel for ladies who have the leisure to read them. But others have their windows arranged with careful ambiguity, suggestive title pages, illustrated covers that make your ears go hot. You're 14. You notice. What you don't know yet is that Holywell Street is famous, or infamous, depending on your perspective. By the next century, it'll be called the vilest street in the civilized world by no less than the Times newspaper. More than 50 shops selling what polite society calls obscene materials, everything from erotic novels to illustrated guides to things that definitely wouldn't be discussed in your village church. But that's later. Right now, you're just a confused apprentice looking for an ironmonger. You find it eventually. Hand over the coins, get your nails, and then, because you're 14 and curious, you take a slightly longer route back. This is when you discover the taverns. They're everywhere. The Rising Sun, the Black Lion, the George, the Crown and Anchor. Every few doors, another establishment offering ale and gin and company to anyone with pennies to spend. Even at this hour, they're doing steady business. Men spill out onto the street, tankards in hand, laughing and arguing and occasionally throwing punches. At one tavern, the Crooked Billet, A woman in a stained dress is standing on an overturned crate, belting out a song with lyrics that make your face burn. The crowd loves it. Coins rain into a basket at her feet. This is Wych Street. This is your new home. A place where the upper floors of buildings nearly touch across streets so narrow that a man could shake hands with his neighbour without leaving his window. Where the buildings themselves are older than memory, survivors of the Great Fire that destroyed so much of London in 1666. Where the shadows hide everything, from romance to robbery. Where the taverns never close, and the songs are never polite. You hurry back to the workshop. The master doesn't ask why you took so long. Maybe he knows. Maybe everyone who comes to Wych Street takes that extra walk, just to understand where they've landed. He puts you to work immediately, sanding. Always sanding at first. Your hands blister within days. Then the blisters pop. Then they blister again. Eventually, the skin toughens into something leather-like. Your palms lose their softness. Your fingers learn the grain of wood. Weeks pass. Then, months. You start to understand the rhythms of this place. The street wakes early, vendors setting up stalls before dawn to claim the best spots. The morning rush comes next, a tide of humanity flowing toward the Strand and Fleet Street, toward the courts and counting houses where the city does its respectable business. Midday brings a lull. The taverns fill with working men eating meat pies and drinking small beer. Afternoon is for shopping, for gossip, for the endless circulation of news and rumour that keeps the neighbourhood alive. And evening. Evening is when Wych Street truly comes alive. The theatres open their doors. The Olympic, the Globe, rebuilt on the site of the old Lion's Inn after some developer decided culture was more profitable than law. The smaller venues, where performers of various talents compete for pennies. The street fills with playgoers, some heading for the legitimate stage, others for the bawdy houses that cluster around the fringes. The taverns overflow. The smell of tobacco and spilled beer mixes with whatever's cooking in the dozens of food stalls that spring up after dark. Oysters, fried fish, hot potatoes, meat of questionable origin shaped into pies and sold for a penny apiece. You learn to move through this chaos without drawing attention, to keep your money in your boot rather than your pocket, to walk with purpose, never dawdling, never making eye contact with strangers, to recognize the different types who frequent these streets, the working men, honest enough if sometimes rough, the criminals, who carry themselves with a certain relaxed confidence, the prostitutes, some barely older than you, working the corners and tavern entrances, the gentlemen, slumming it for the thrill, easy targets for pickpockets. You learn who to trust. Will becomes something like a friend. He teaches you the shortcuts through the neighbouring alleys, the best places to buy food, which taverns water their beer and which serve it straight, which shopkeepers will extend credit and which will have you thrown in debtor's prison for an unpaid farthing. The master carpenter is hard, but fair. He hits you sometimes when you make mistakes, but no harder than he hits Will, and he makes sure you're fed. His wife slips you extra bread when she can. Their children, 2 girls and a boy, watch you with curious eyes but never speak. This is life in Wych Street, cramped, dirty, dangerous, but also alive, in a way your village never was. Back home, every day was the same. Here, every day is a small adventure. A fire in a nearby chimney that brings the whole street running with buckets. A public execution cart passing through on its way to Tyburn. The condemned man either weeping or laughing, or staring straight ahead with empty eyes. A brawl spilling out of a tavern, men rolling in the filth while the crowd cheers. A travelling performer with a trained monkey that picks pockets while its master distracts. You're starting to settle in, starting to feel like you might survive this. Then, one evening in your 6th month, you see something that changes everything. You're in the workshop, alone. Will's gone to run an errand. The master's upstairs with his family. You're working by candlelight, finishing the sanding on a chair leg that needs to be perfect by morning.
Through the window, you see someone slip out of the building across the street. It's a young man, early 20s maybe, small and slight, with the kind of boyish face that makes him look younger than he is. He moves with an easy confidence, like someone who knows exactly where he's going and exactly how to get there. What's strange is how he moves. Not through the door, but through a window on the 2nd floor. He drops onto a narrow ledge, catches himself, swings down to the street with the grace of a cat. He sees you watching. For a moment, your eyes meet. He grins, tips an invisible hat, and vanishes into the darkness of Holywell Street. You don't know it yet, but you've just seen one of the most famous men in London. His name is Jack Shepherd. He was apprenticed to a carpenter, just like you, not far from where you're standing now. But unlike you, he didn't stick with the trade. He fell in love with a woman who worked the streets, fell in with a crowd of thieves, and fell, eventually, into a career of burglary that's making him the talk of every tavern in the city. By next year, he'll escape from Newgate Prison twice. From the most secure cells in England, locked in irons, chained to the floor, he'll pick locks and break chains and scale walls and somehow walk free, again and again, until even his enemies have to admire his nerve. By next year, Daniel Defoe himself will write his biography. Crowds will pay just to see him in his cell. 200,000 people will line the streets on the day of his hanging, many of them weeping. But right now, in this moment, he's just a figure disappearing into the dark. Just another young man trying to survive Wych Street by whatever means necessary. You turn back to your sanding. The candle burns low. Outside, the sounds of the evening continue. Laughter from the tavern, a woman shouting at someone in the street, the distant clatter of a coach on the Strand. You're a long way from home, but you're starting to think you might belong here. Sleep now, in that hard pallet in the corner of the workshop. Let the sounds of Wych Street fade into the background hum they become when you're too tired to process them. Tomorrow, there'll be more sanding, more learning, more survival. And just outside your door, a whole world of thieves and poets and pornographers and dreamers, living and dying and loving and scheming in streets so narrow the sun barely reaches the ground. This is your London now. Rest your eyes. Let go. Tomorrow is another day in the slum. Winter comes to Wych Street, like a thief. One morning you wake up and the cold has seeped into your bones, through the thin blanket, through the straw pallet, through whatever warmth your body managed to hold on to during the night. The workshop has no real heating, just a small iron stove that the master lights on the coldest days, burning whatever scraps of wood are too small to use for anything else. You huddle near it when you can, but there's work to be done, and the master doesn't care if your fingers are numb. You learn to keep moving. Sawing warms you up. Planing warms you up. Even sanding, if you do it fast enough, generates enough friction to keep your hands from going completely stiff. Will teaches you a trick. Rub your hands with lard before bed.
It keeps the skin from cracking in the cold. The master's wife gives you a bit from the kitchen, and you smear it on every night, ignoring how it smells, grateful for anything that stops the bleeding. But the real enemy isn't the cold itself. It's the fog. London fog is something else entirely. Back in your village, fog meant a morning mist that burned off by noon. Here, the fog comes and stays. Days at a time sometimes, weeks. It rolls in from the Thames, mixing with the smoke from 100,000 coal fires, and it creates something that barely qualifies as air. They call it a pea super. The colour is right, yellowish green, thick enough that you can barely see your hand in front of your face. It gets into everything, your clothes, your lungs, your food. You cough constantly during fog season, and so does everyone else. The sound of London in winter is the sound of a city hacking its lungs out. Worse, everything becomes slick and greasy. The walls, the cobblestones, your skin, if you're outside long enough. The fog deposits a film of soot and coal tar on every surface it touches. Wealthy women don't even try to wear white anymore. What's the point? It'll be grey within the hour. The fog makes the streets even more dangerous. You can't see who's coming. Can't see who's behind you. The footpads love it. They can step out of nowhere, do their business, and vanish back into the murk before anyone even knows what happened. Will tells you about a man who got lost in the fog last year. Walked right into the Thames. They found his body 3 days later, washed up near the docks. He'd lived in London his whole life, knew these streets better than anyone. But the fog turned everything around, made familiar things strange, and he walked right off the edge of the world. You stick close to the buildings now. Trail your fingers along the walls, count your steps, anything to keep your bearings in that yellow murk. The other thing about winter is the mud. Now, calling it mud is generous. The streets of Wych Street are paved, sort of, with cobblestones that have shifted and cracked over the centuries. Between them, packed earth that turns to slush in the rain. And on top of everything, the constant accumulation of horse dung, rotting vegetables, human waste tossed from chamber pots, dead animals, and whatever else 300,000 people can produce in the course of daily life. This mixture gets churned by cartwheels and horse hooves and human feet into something that defies description. It's black, it's slippery, it smells like death having a bad day, and it's everywhere, inches deep in the middle of the road, splashing onto your clothes every time a cart rattles past. Rich people have sedan chairs. They get carried above the filth by sweating porters, never touching the ground at all. The middling sort hire link boys to light their way and sweep a path. But you wade through it like everyone else. Your shoes are permanently stained. Your stockings are a lost cause. The master sends you out one morning in December to deliver a finished cabinet to a customer on the Strand. A wealthy merchant, the kind of man who can afford custom furniture. Don't get it dirty, the master says, and don't let anyone see you coming from this direction. You understand. The merchant doesn't want his fine new cabinet associated with the stink of Wych Street, so you take the long way around, skirting the edge of the slum, approaching the Strand from a more respectable angle. The merchant's house is another world. Clean windows, polished brass. A servant who takes the cabinet from you without meeting your eyes, like you're not quite a person, just a delivery mechanism with legs. You're back on Wych Street by noon, and because the master gave you a whole shilling for your trouble, you decide to spend a penny of it at one of the coffee houses. This is where things get interesting. The George Inn sits on a side street, just off Wych Street proper. It's been there since 1723, originally as a coffee house, though they serve ale and wine now too. It's a step up from the rougher taverns, the kind of place where a man might conduct business, meet associates, read the newspapers that circulate from table to table. You've walked past it 100 times, never gone in. But today, with a penny burning a hole in your pocket and the cold gnawing at your bones, you push through the door. The warmth hits you first. A real fire burning in a real fireplace, not the pathetic little stove in the workshop. The smell of coffee and tobacco smoke and roasting meat. The hum of conversation, men talking politics and trade and gossip. You find a corner seat, order a dish of coffee. It costs a penny, but it buys you the right to sit by the fire as long as you want, and the warmth alone is worth it. The coffee is bitter and strange. You've never had it before, but it's hot, and it gives you a jolt of energy that ale never does, and you start to understand why the wealthy classes are so fond of the stuff. You sit, and you watch, and you listen. The men here are a mixed lot. Some are clearly gentlemen, or at least trying to look like gentlemen. Clean coats, powdered wigs, the affected speech of people who want you to know they've had an education. Others are tradesmen like your master, here to make contacts or close deals. And others still are harder to place. Men with watchful eyes and careful smiles, who could be anything from merchants to criminals to both. One man stands out. He's older, heavy-set, sitting at a table by himself, surrounded by papers and books, muttering to himself as he writes. Every few minutes he looks up, scowls at the room like it's personally offended him, and goes back to his work. The serving girl catches you staring. "That's Mr. Johnson," she says. "The dictionary man. Uses this place as his office, he does. Gets his letters sent here and everything. Samuel Johnson. You've heard the name. Even in your village people knew about the dictionary. The great project to capture the entire English language in a single book. Years of work. Thousands of pages. The achievement of a lifetime. And here he is, in a coffee house off Wych Street, scratching away at whatever he's working on now, looking like he hasn't slept in a week. You watch him for a while. The way he crumples up pages and tosses them aside. The way he mutters and curses under his breath. The way he calls for more coffee without looking up from his work. So this is what genius looks like. Tired and grumpy and sitting in the corner of a coffee house, trying to make words do what he wants them to do. Another man enters, well-dressed, friendly smile, carrying himself with the ease of someone who's comfortable everywhere he goes. "Mr. Johnson," he approaches the writer's table. "A pleasure, as always." Johnson looks up, his scowl deepens. "Perfect. What do you want?" "Perfect. Henry Perfect. You'll learn more about him later. How he was born to a clerical family, trained for the church, but found the life of a con man more suited to his talents. How he dresses as a vicar and talks his way into respectable homes, charming old ladies out of their savings with tales of charitable causes that don't exist. Right now, he's playing his part perfectly. Smooth voice, trustworthy face. He slides into a seat across from Johnson and starts talking about some literary project he claims to be funding. Johnson isn't buying it. You can tell from the way his eyes narrow, the way he keeps his hand on his purse. "I have work to do, Mr. Perfect. Good day." Perfect smiles, not offended at all, and moves on to another table, another mark. The game never stops for men like him. You finish your coffee, slip back out into the cold. The serving girl's words stay with you, though. Gets his letters sent here. You realise that for men like Johnson, a coffee house isn't just a place to drink. It's an office, a meeting room, a postal address, In a city where half the population can barely afford a room, let alone a proper house, these establishments become something like home for the men who use them. You've learned something today. These streets aren't just full of footpads and prostitutes. They're full of geniuses and con men and everyone in between, the high and the low, rubbing shoulders in the same cramped rooms, breathing the same foul air. Spring comes eventually, the fog lifts, the mud dries, sort of, and your apprenticeship starts to feel less like survival and more like education. The master takes you out on jobs now, real jobs, installing cabinets in houses all over central London, fitting doors and window frames, repairing furniture for people who can't afford to replace it. You see how the other half lives. The townhouses in Mayfair with their high ceilings and expensive wallpaper, the counting houses in the city with their stern clerks and mountains of ledgers, the great houses of the aristocracy, glimpsed through servants' entrances while you haul in your tools, and you see how the very bottom lives too. One job takes you past the edge of St. Giles, the Rookery, they call it, and if Wych Street seemed rough when you arrived, St. Giles is something else entirely. The houses here aren't just cramped, they're collapsing, walls held up by sheer stubbornness, roofs patched with whatever scraps could be scavenged, entire families living in single rooms, sometimes in cellars, sometimes in spaces you wouldn't keep a dog. The smell is beyond description. Open sewers run through the streets, cesspits overflow into basements. The dead are sometimes left where they fall because nobody can afford to bury them. This is where people end up when they have nowhere else to go. The Irish immigrants fleeing famine back home, the families broken by debt or drink or disease, the criminals who need a place where even the watch won't follow. You hurry past. Keep your head down. Clutch your tools close. On your way back, you pass through the old legal quarter. This part of Wych Street has a different feel, quieter, more respectable, if that word means anything around here. The Inns of Chancery stand here, or what's left of them. Lion's Inn, New Inn, names that used to mean something. Back in the old days, these were places where lawyers learned their trade. Young men from good families, studying the law, boarding in grand buildings, preparing for careers in the courts. New Inn is where Sir Thomas More got his education, before he became Lord Chancellor, before he fell out with Henry VIII, before they cut his head off on Tower Hill. The man who wrote Utopia, that dream of a perfect society, learned to argue and reason in rooms just a few yards from where you're standing now. But that was centuries ago. By the time you arrived, the inns had degenerated into something else entirely. The grand buildings are subdivided now, crammed with lodgers who have nothing to do with the law, gamblers, swindlers, men who'd rather not be found. A historian will later describe the whole area between Wych Street and Holywell Street as having witnessed scenes of the most disgraceful and infamous character. He's not wrong. But there's history mixed in with the disgrace. Layers of London, stacked on top of each other. The respectable past and the disreputable present sharing the same crooked walls. Back on Wych Street, you feel almost grateful for what you have. A roof that doesn't leak too badly. Food most days. Work that's honest, even if it's hard. That night, lying on your pallet, you think about the distances that separate these worlds. A few hundred yards from the Strand to St. Giles, from wealth to poverty, from comfort to desperation, and Wych Street sits right in the middle. Neither one thing nor the other. A boundary zone where anything is possible and nothing is safe. The summer brings visitors. Wych Street has always attracted a certain kind of person. Writers mostly. The cramped buildings and crooked streets and colourful characters make good material. You start to recognise them, these literary types, wandering through with notebooks, scribbling down observations, looking at the poverty like it's a curiosity rather than a condition. One of them stops to talk to you. He's young, maybe mid-20s, intense eyes, the hungry look of someone who hasn't quite made it yet, but desperately wants to. "You work here?" he asks. "In the carpentry shop." You confirm you work in the carpentry shop. "What's it like, living in a place like this?" You're not sure how to answer. What's it like? It's like trying to breathe through a wet rag while people steal from you and the buildings fall down around your ears. But it's also home now, or the closest thing to home you've got. "It's all right," you say. You get used to it. He writes something in his notebook, thanks you, moves on. You'll never know his name, but years from now, when a book called Bleak House comes out, and everyone's talking about the author who captures the dark heart of London so perfectly, you'll wonder if that young man found what he was looking for on these streets. The autumn brings your first real trouble. You're coming back from a delivery late in the evening. The master kept you working past dark because a customer was impatient, and now you're hurrying through streets that have turned dangerous with the setting sun. You hear footsteps behind you. Will's advice echoes in your head. Don't look back. Don't run. Running just makes you look like prey. You speed up anyway. The footsteps speed up too. A hand grabs your collar, yanks you into an alley. There are two of them, rough looking. One has a knife that catches the faint light from a window somewhere above. Your money. Now. Your money. The few coins you earned from this week's deliveries. The sum total of everything you own in the world. You hand it over. What else can you do? They take it. Take your hat too, for good measure. Shove you against the wall hard enough to knock the wind out of you. And then they're gone, melting into the darkness like they were never there at all. You sit in that alley for a long time, catching your breath, waiting for your heart to stop pounding. This is what they warned you about. This is what everyone warned you about. But here's the thing. You're still alive. You still have your tools. You still have your apprenticeship. In Wych Street, that counts as a good outcome. You pick yourself up, brush off your clothes, walk the rest of the way home with your head up, even though you're trembling inside. The master doesn't ask about the missing hat. Maybe he knows. Maybe everyone just knows. Will gives you an extra piece of bread at dinner. Doesn't say anything about it. Just passes it over like it's nothing. You eat it slowly, watching the candle burn down in the workshop window, listening to the sounds of the street outside, laughter and shouting, and somewhere, faintly, music. Tomorrow you'll start over, save your coins again, learn to watch your back a little better, keep surviving. That's all anyone does here, really. Keep surviving, one day at a time, one narrow street at a time, in the cramped and dangerous and strangely beautiful heart of old London. Close your eyes now. Let the sounds fade. Tomorrow's another day. 2 years into your apprenticeship, the master finally trusts you with tools. Real tools. Not the sanding blocks and scraps you've been working with. A proper set of chisels, worn but sharp, passed down from an apprentice who didn't make it. Fever took him, same as the master's children, same as a lot of people around here. You don't ask whose they were, you just take them, keep them clean, learn to use them like extensions of your own hands. The work changes after that, more precise, more skilled. You're not just smoothing surfaces anymore, you're cutting joints, fitting panels, shaping wood into something that might actually be beautiful if you do it right. Will finishes his apprenticeship that spring. 7 years, served in full, and now he's a journeyman carpenter with the right to take paying work on his own. He could leave, find a shop somewhere else, maybe even save up enough to become a master himself one day. He doesn't leave. "Where would I go?" he says. "This is home." He rents a room above one of the taverns on Holywell Street, cramped, probably crawling with bedbugs, but his own. The ceiling sags in the middle. The floorboards creak with every step. Rain gets in through gaps around the window frame. But he pays his own rent and answers to no one, which counts for a lot in a place like this. You visit sometimes, after work, sharing a pot of ale and watching the chaos of the street below. From Will's window you can see straight down into the heart of Holywell Street's famous book trade. Now, you'd noticed the bookshops before, hard not to, but you'd never really understood what was happening in them until Will explained it. See that one? 3 doors down? The one with the crescent moon sign? You see it. An old shop, the oldest on the street according to Will, with a golden half moon hanging above the door. The moon has a face painted on it, pouty lips, thick eyebrows, the kind of expression that suggests it's seen things it would rather forget. That's been there longer than anyone can remember, selling books the whole time, but not just any books. You've heard rumours. Everyone on these streets has heard rumours, but Will lays it out plain. The respectable booksellers deal in religious texts, political pamphlets, the occasional novel, standard fare, nothing to raise an eyebrow. But mixed in among them, hidden behind innocent storefronts, a different kind of trade flourishes. Erotic literature, illustrated guides to activities your village vicar would choke on his communion wine just thinking about. Pamphlets attacking the government in terms that could get a man thrown in prison. Heretical religious texts that question everything from the divinity of Christ to the existence of God himself. All of it technically illegal, all of it selling like hot bread on a cold morning. How do they get away with it? Will shrugs. Who's going to stop them? The magistrates? Half of them are customers. The church? They'd have to admit they know what's in there, and nobody wants to do that. You watch a gentleman in a fine coat slip into the shop with the crescent moon. He's inside for maybe 10 minutes, comes out with a package wrapped in brown paper, tucked under his arm like it contains nothing more scandalous than cheese. The thing is, it's not just about the dirty books. Will explains that too. A lot of what gets sold on Holywell Street started as something else entirely. Political writing, radical ideas, the kind of thinking that got people killed in France and could get them killed here too if the wrong person was listening. The publishers and booksellers on this street have been mixing sedition with pornography for generations, hiding dangerous thoughts behind titillating covers. If the authorities come looking for revolutionary pamphlets, all they find is smut, and nobody wants to admit they were buying smut. Clever, dangerously clever. You file this away. Keep walking past the bookshops with your eyes forward. You're not interested in that kind of trouble. What you are interested in is music. There's a shop at number 26 Wych Street. Musical instruments, flutes mostly, but also clarinets, pianos, anything a person with money and musical ambition might want. The sign above the door reads Astor and Company. You've passed it 100 times, heard the sound of instruments being tested inside, scales and arpeggios drifting out into the street. Once, you stopped to watch a craftsman in the window, carefully shaping the body of a flute with tools not so different from your own. The owner's son works the counter most days. Young fellow, thick German accent, always smiling. His name is John, or Johann if you catch him when he's tired and slips back into his native tongue. You strike up a conversation one afternoon. You're delivering a cabinet to a house nearby, and you stop to admire a piano in the window. "Beautiful, yes?" John says. "English make, very popular now." You ask how much something like that costs. He names a figure that would take you 3 years to earn. "Ah, but for listening is free," he says, and sits down to play a few bars of something you don't recognize. Something complicated and light, his fingers moving over the keys like it's the easiest thing in the world. You listen until you have to go. What you don't know, what nobody on this street knows yet, is that John isn't going to stay here. He's got plans. America, he says, though he doesn't say it to you. A brother there in New York who started a butcher shop. Another brother here in London making the instruments. And John, the youngest, dreaming of something bigger. Within the year he'll be gone. Sailed to Baltimore with a cargo of flutes and a head full of ambition. He'll make his fortune, not in music but in furs, trading pelts with the natives up in the northern wilderness. And then he'll make another fortune, in opium shipped to China, of all things, and then another in New York real estate. By the time he dies, John Jacob Astor will be the richest man in America, the country's first multi-millionaire. And it'll all have started here, in a cramped little shop on Wych Street, selling flutes to Londoners who couldn't have imagined where that awkward German boy would end up. But that's the future. Right now, he's just another young man trying to make his way, same as you. The theatres pull you in eventually. You've heard about them, of course. Wych Street is thick with performance venues, from the grand to the grubby. But apprentices don't have money for theatre tickets, and even if you did, the master would tan your hide for wasting it. Still, there are ways. The stage doors open onto back alleys. If you time it right, you can catch the tail end of a performance by lurking near an exit. The sound carries, the laughter, the gasps. Sometimes a door props open and you glimpse painted scenery, actors in costume, the impossible magic of people becoming other people right before your eyes. The Globe Theatre sits where Lions Inn used to stand, third theatre to carry that famous name, though it's got nothing to do with Shakespeare's original. Some developer decided that knocking down a law school and putting up a playhouse was progress. Maybe he was right. The lawyers who used to study here were already gone, replaced by gamblers and drifters. At least the theatre brings in paying customers. Word is they're planning another theatre down the street. The Olympic, they'll call it. Someone's already bought the old Drury House site and started clearing it. The rumour going around the taverns is that they're going to build it from the timbers of a French warship captured during the wars, a whole theatre made from enemy wood. Only in London would someone think that was a selling point. Across the street, the Shakespeare's Head Tavern does a roaring trade before and after performances. The name's a bit of cheek, linking itself to the famous playwright even though he'd never set foot in this particular establishment. But nobody cares about accuracy when there's money to be made. Late one night, you stumble onto something remarkable. You're on your way back from a delivery that ran long. The streets are quiet by Wych Street standards, which means only a dozen drunks instead of 100. You're passing the Shakespeare's Head when you hear laughter inside. Not normal tavern laughter, something more sustained, more organised. You peek through the window. A group of men sits around a large table, drinking and arguing and clearly having the time of their lives. They're well dressed, these men. Writers and artists and editors, by the look of them. The kind of people who stay up all night because the ideas won't stop coming. Someone notices you looking, waves you in. You shouldn't. The master expects you back. But something about the scene is too interesting to resist. Inside, the air is thick with tobacco smoke and clever conversation. A man at the head of the table is holding forth on the state of English literature, gesturing with a pipe that scatters ash everywhere. Others interrupt him, disagree with him, buy him drinks to make him shut up. "The Club of Owls," someone explains when you ask. "We keep late hours, hence the name." You have no idea what any of them are talking about. Philosophy? Politics? The proper way to structure a sonnet? It's all Greek to you, and some of it might literally be Greek for all you know. But you listen anyway, nursing a single ale that someone presses into your hand, watching these men argue about ideas like ideas are the most important thing in the world. One of them, a younger fellow with ink stains on his fingers, asks what you do. "Carpenter's apprentice, down the street." He nods like that's perfectly reasonable. Honest work, more than most of us can claim. Years later, you'll learn that this man went on to edit a magazine called Punch, that he lived upstairs from this very tavern for a while, surrounded by the chaos of Wych Street, writing satire that would make emperors uncomfortable. But tonight, he's just another dreamer, drinking too much and talking too fast, trying to figure out what kind of man he wants to be. You slip out before anyone expects you to say anything clever. Back to the workshop, back to reality. But something's shifted. You've seen behind the curtain, just a little, seen that the world isn't just divided into rich and poor, respectable and criminal. There's a whole other category of people who live by their minds, who trade in words and ideas instead of goods and services. And they're here, on your street, drinking in your taverns. Your world is bigger than you thought. The year turns. 1786 becomes 1787. Your apprenticeship enters its middle phase. The work gets harder in some ways, easier in others. Harder because the master expects more. Easier because you actually know what you're doing now. Your hands have learned the language of wood. You can look at a piece of oak and see the grain, know where it wants to be cut, anticipate how it'll behave when you shape it. The street changes too. Some shops close, others open. The usual churn of any neighbourhood. But Wych Street has a way of staying the same even as everything transforms. The buildings still lean, the alleys still stink, the pickpockets still prowl. One morning, you wake to shouting in the street. Not unusual, people shout all the time around here. But this sounds different, organised, a crowd, gathering and growing. You push your way outside. A cart is making its way down Wych Street, a heavy wooden cart pulled by 2 horses, surrounded by constables with clubs and worried faces. And in the back, standing with his hands bound but his head held high, a young man you recognise. Jack Shepherd. They caught him again. Everyone knew they would, eventually. The escapes couldn't go on forever, not from Newgate, not from the most secure prison in England. This time they'd kept him in irons, chained to the floor in a cell called the Stone Castle, watched around the clock by guards who'd been promised rewards if he stayed put. And still, somehow, he'd gotten out, picked the locks on his chains with a bent nail, broke through 6 locked doors, scaled the prison wall in the dark. They found him a week later, drunk in a tavern, because of course they did. Even geniuses make stupid choices. But here's the thing. The crowd isn't angry at Jack. They're angry for him. Women throw flowers, men cheer his name, children run alongside the cart, reaching up like he's some kind of saint instead of a thief. The constables look nervous. They're outnumbered 100 to 1, and everybody knows it. Jack spots you in the crowd. For a moment, your eyes meet. Same as that night years ago. when you saw him slip out a window like a cat. He grins, that same boyish grin, tips his head in acknowledgement, and then the cart moves on, toward the Strand, toward Tyburn, toward the gallows where his luck will finally run out. You don't follow, can't stomach it, but you hear about it later. Everyone hears about it. 200,000 people showed up to watch Jack Sheppard hang. That's more than the entire population of most English cities. They lined the route from Newgate to Tyburn, weeping and cheering in equal measure. Some of them wore white, like it was a wedding instead of an execution. His lover Bess had a plan to rescue him. Grab the body after the required 15 minutes on the rope, rush him to a doctor, try to revive him before death became permanent. It had worked before, with other hanged men. The body doesn't always die right away, but the crowd ruined it. They surged forward, trying to touch him, trying to help in their own misguided way. They pulled on his legs to speed the end, thinking they were doing him a mercy. By the time Bess got close, there was nothing left to save. 22 years old, that's all Jack Sheppard got. A carpenter's apprentice who learned to pick locks instead of cut joints. A boy who fell in love with the wrong woman in a tavern just down the street from where you're sleeping right now. A legend who burns so bright that Daniel Defoe himself wrote his biography. You think about him for a long time after. Think about the choices that separate one life from another. He started where you started. Same streets, same trade, same options. But he made different choices. And here you are, still breathing, while Jack Sheppard swings from a rope and becomes a story people will tell for centuries. You go back to work. What else is there to do? The chisel feels solid in your hand. The wood shavings curl away clean. Outside, Wych Street keeps moving, keeps living, keeps forgetting the dead boy who used to haunt its shadows. Close your eyes now. Let the sounds of the street fade. You've earned your rest tonight. Tomorrow, the work continues. Fever comes for you in the summer of 1788. You don't know where you caught it. Could have been anywhere. The water you drank from the public pump, drawn from wells that sat a few feet from overflowing cesspits. The food you bought from a street vendor whose hygiene was questionable at best. The air itself, thick with the exhalations of 250,000 people crammed into spaces meant for 1/10 that number. One morning you wake up and your bones ache. By noon, you're shivering despite the July heat. By evening, you can barely stand. The master's wife takes one look at you and crosses herself. Get him out of the workshop, now. They carry you upstairs, lay you on a pallet in the corner of the family's own cramped quarters. This is either a kindness or a practical decision. If you die in the workshop, they'll have to burn everything you touched. Upstairs, at least, the damage is contained. You drift in and out for days, maybe weeks. Time stops making sense. There are moments of clarity when you can see the cracked ceiling above you, hear the sounds of Wych Street filtering through the thin walls, and there are stretches of darkness where nothing exists except heat and pain, and the sound of your own heart struggling to keep beating. The worst is the thirst. Your body burns from the inside, and all you want is water, but they ration it carefully. Too much and you'll vomit it right back up. Too little, and you'll dry out like leather in the sun. The master's wife knows the balance, learned it from watching too many people die. She feeds you broth when you can keep it down, wipes your forehead with cloths soaked in water that's probably contaminated with the same filth that made you sick in the first place, mutters prayers in a dialect you don't recognise, something her grandmother taught her back in whatever country she came from before washing up on these shores. At one point, they send for a doctor. You learn this later. He took one look, charged his fee, and said there was nothing to be done except wait and see if your constitution was strong enough to fight it off. Some people survive this kind of fever. Most don't. The doctor didn't offer odds either way. You see things during the fever. Your mother standing by the window telling you to come home. Your father, dead these 5 years now, reaching out his hand. A woman you don't recognize with kind eyes and a voice like water over stones. When the fever finally breaks, you're thin as a rail and weak as a kitten, but alive. Thought we'd lose you, Will says, sitting beside your pallet with a cup of small beer. The odds weren't good. You ask how long. 3 weeks, maybe a bit more. The master had to take on a day labourer to cover your work. 3 weeks. An eternity in a place where missing one day's wages can mean missing one day's food. But you're alive, and in Wych Street, that's never a guarantee. Recovery takes another month. You start with small tasks, sitting up, walking across the room, climbing down the stairs to the workshop without your legs giving out beneath you. The master doesn't rush you, can't afford to lose another apprentice probably. Training a new one would take years. By autumn, you're back to something like normal. Thinner than before, weaker in ways that might never fully heal, but working, earning, surviving. The fever changes things though, makes you see the world differently. You've looked into the dark, and it looked back, and now everything feels a little more precious, a little more fragile. The warmth of the workshop fire, the taste of bread when you've gone hungry, the sound of laughter drifting out of a tavern on a cold night. You start spending more time at the Rising Sun. It sits near where Wych Street meets the Strand, in a building that's been a drinking establishment for as long as anyone can remember. Before they called it the Rising Sun, it went by another name, the Crooked Billet, after some old heraldic symbol that probably meant something to somebody 100 years ago. The building itself is ancient, one of those timber-frame survivors from before the Great Fire, leaning slightly to the left like it's had one too many drinks itself. The place has a reputation, a certain kind of reputation. On Saturday nights, a couple of women climb onto barrels outside the door and belt out songs that would make a sailor blush. Filthy verses about what goes on behind closed doors, sung loud enough to carry halfway down the street. The passers-by love it, toss coins into a hat, cheer for the dirtiest lyrics. Sometimes respectable gentlemen stop to listen, pretending they're just passing through, lingering a little too long with guilty smiles on their faces. It's theatre, in a way. Low theatre, the kind the fancy playhouses would never touch. But the crowds don't care about fancy. They want entertainment, and the bawdy wenches of the Rising Sun deliver, have been delivering according to the regulars since their grandmother's time. Inside it's even livelier, a long room with a bar down one side and tables crammed everywhere else. Sawdust on the floor to soak up the spilled beer and the occasional blood. A fire that's either too hot or not hot enough, depending on where you're sitting. And people. Always people. Dock workers and clerks and pickpockets and merchants, all rubbing elbows in the same smoky space. You come here now because it's warmer than your pallet in the workshop, because the beer helps you sleep, because after 3 weeks of staring at death, you want to be around living people, doing living things. And because of her. She works the bar. Dark hair pulled back under a cap, quick hands, quicker tongue, the kind of woman who can talk down a drunk twice her size and still have time to pour your drink before you finish asking for it. Her name is Mary. Common enough name. Common enough story too, when you finally get her to share it. Came to London from somewhere up north, looking for work. Found this. Could be worse. Could be out on the street like some of the other girls. At least here she has a roof, regular meals, and some measure of protection from the landlord who knows a good barmaid is worth more alive than dead. You don't fall in love exactly. Love is for people with time and money and futures they can plan. What happens is simpler. A connection. A recognition. Two people in the same storm, grateful for any shelter they can find. She gives you extra bread sometimes, when nobody's looking. You fix the loose hinge on the storeroom door, the one that's been driving her mad for months. Small exchanges, the currency of people who have nothing else to trade. Winter comes again. Your third winter on Wych Street. The cold feels different now. Less like an enemy, more like an old acquaintance you've learned to live with. You know the rhythms of this place by heart now. The morning rush of vendors, the midday lull, the evening surge when the theatres let out and the taverns fill up, the late night quiet that's never quite quiet, always humming with footsteps and whispers and the distant sound of trouble. You know the people too, the regulars at the Rising Sun, each with their own story, their own tragedy, their own small victories. Old Peters, who claims he once served in the Navy and shows the scars to prove it, though his stories change depending on how much he's had to drink. Margaret the match seller, who's ancient beyond counting and knows every secret on the street, and will share them too if you buy her enough gin. Young Danny, apprenticed to the butcher, always covered in blood and always cheerful about it, dreaming of the day he'll own his own shop. There's also Carpenter John, no relation to the Astor brothers, a journeyman who drinks too much and works too little, and serves as a warning of what you might become if you're not careful. And Widow Harris, who takes in laundry and mending and gossip in equal measure, and who knows exactly who's sleeping with whom in every building on the street. And the Irishman whose name nobody can pronounce, who fled something back home that he never talks about, and who plays the fiddle so beautifully that even the bawdy wenches stop to listen. These are your neighbours now, your community, the closest thing to a family you've had since leaving your village all those years ago. One night, after closing, Mary tells you a story. There's a spot near the Rising Sun, she says, an open bit of frontage where the building juts out a little, creating a natural space for people to gather. Years ago, before anyone alive can remember, two gentlemen fought a duel right there. Over what? She shrugs. A woman, probably. Isn't it always? The story goes that they'd met earlier that evening in a tavern on Fleet Street. Words were exchanged, insults, something about the affections of a lady neither one of them had any real claim to. By the time they made it back to Wych Street, swords were drawn. One of them died, maybe both. The stories don't agree. But the spot where it happened became a kind of landmark. People pointed to it, told the tale, kept the memory alive even as the blood soaked into the ground and disappeared. Silly really, Mary says, dying over a woman you barely knew. You think about Jack Shepherd, about how he met Edgeworth Bess in a tavern not so different from this one, how he threw away a promising career for a woman who led him into crime, and eventually to the gallows. People do stupid things for love, or whatever they mistake for love. Would you, Mary asks, fight for someone? You consider the question. A year ago, you'd have said no. What's the point? Life's hard enough without adding violence to the mix. But now, looking at her face in the candlelight, you're not so sure. Depends on who, you say. She smiles, doesn't say anything more. The spring brings better weather and worse news. The landlord of the Rising Sun is selling up, moving somewhere respectable, now that he's made enough money off Wych Street's vices. The new owner, whoever it turns out to be, might keep things as they are.
or might clean house, might decide that bawdy wenches and cheap beer aren't the image he wants for his establishment. Mary doesn't know if she'll still have a job next month. There's always work, she says, but the way she says it makes clear what kind of work she means. The kind that happens in the darker alleys, with strangers who don't care about names or stories. You want to tell her that won't happen, that you'll protect her somehow. But what power do you have? You're an apprentice carpenter, 3 years from finishing your indenture, living on scraps in a corner of a workshop. All you can do is keep showing up, keep drinking the same bad beer, keep fixing what's broken when you can. The new owner arrives in April, a man named Cartwright, fat and jolly, with the look of someone who's done well in trade and wants a retirement project. He tours the premises with the kind of satisfied smile that suggests he's already counting the profits. Mary keeps her job, so do the bawdy wenches. Turns out Cartwright is more interested in money than morality, and the Saturday night shows pack the place to the rafters. Life goes on. That summer, you finish your 4th year of apprenticeship, more than halfway done now. The skills come easier. You can look at a drawing and see the finished piece in your mind, know exactly which cuts to make, which joints to use, how the wood will behave under your hands. The master starts trusting you with more complex work, cabinets with delicate inlays, chairs that need to balance beauty and strength, the kind of pieces that wealthy customers pay good money for, that might survive for generations if they're made right. You're becoming something, not just a pair of hands doing what it's told. A craftsman, someone who understands the wood at a level that goes deeper than technique. Wych Street is becoming something too, or rather, it's becoming more of what it already was. The old buildings keep leaning, keep settling into the mud. The street gets narrower every year, it seems, as upper floors are extended further and further out, blocking more and more of the sky. Walk down the middle of Wych Street at noon on a sunny day, and you might as well be in a tunnel. The light barely reaches the ground. This makes it perfect for certain activities. The footpads love the darkness. So do the pickpockets. So do the assignations that happen in doorways, quick and commercial, over before anyone really notices. The respectable world stays on the Strand, just a few hundred yards away, but might as well be a different universe. Wych Street belongs to the shadows. You've learnt to carry yourself differently now. Head up, eyes forward, a small knife in your boot. Not that you've ever had to use it. The confidence of someone who belongs, who knows the territory, who isn't worth the risk of robbing because he probably doesn't have anything worth taking. It's protection of a sort. Not perfect. Nothing's perfect here. But better than being the frightened boy who stumbled off the coach 5 years ago. Village soft and completely unprepared. You think about that boy sometimes. Wonder what he'd make of you now. The calluses on your hands. The scar on your arm from a chisel that slipped. The way you can walk through the darkest alley without flinching. Navigate by sound and smell when the fog rolls in. Read the street like a book written in a language only locals understand. You've been swallowed by London, and somehow you survived. Autumn again. The leaves that managed to grow in the tiny churchyards turn brown and fall. The smell of decay mixes with the usual stink of the streets. The fog returns, yellow and greasy, wrapping the world in a chemical embrace. Mary's still at the rising sun, still giving you extra bread when nobody's looking, still smiling when you walk through the door, even when she's tired, even when some drunk has been giving her trouble, even when everything feels like too much. You're not sure what this is between you. Not love, you keep telling yourself, not anything with a future, just two people, keeping each other warm in a cold city, waiting to see what happens next. But when she laughs at something you say, when her hand brushes yours as she passes a drink across the bar,
when her eyes find you in a crowded room like you're the only person there. You wonder if maybe you're wrong. Maybe it is love. Maybe that's exactly what this is. Settle deeper into your pillow now. The street sounds fade into the familiar hum of 500,000 souls, dreaming and scheming and surviving in the greatest city on earth. You're one of them now. You belong. Let sleep take you. The morning will come soon enough. The year 1789 changes everything. Not here, not at first. The revolution happens across the Channel in France, where angry crowds storm a prison called the Bastille, and the whole order of things starts to crack. Within months, a king who ruled by divine right is running for his life. Within years, he'll lose his head to a machine designed specifically for the purpose. And suddenly, everyone's talking about liberty and equality, and whether the same thing could happen in England. You hear about it in the taverns, at the Rising Sun, at the Angel, at every drinking hole between Wych Street and Covent Garden. Opinions run hot, fueled by beer and fear and something that feels almost like hope. Some men raise their glasses to the French, call them heroes, say it's about time the common people rose up against their masters, about time the rich learned what it felt like to be afraid. Others shake their heads, predict chaos and bloodshed, warn that this kind of thing never ends well. Revolution eats its own children, they say. Give it time. Old Peters claims he saw the French fleet once, back in his navy days, says they're not to be underestimated. The Irishman just laughs and says he hopes the fever spreads, hopes every king in Europe ends up shorter by a head. Widow Harris tells them both to shut up before they get everyone arrested. The booksellers on Holywell Street pay very close attention. For years, they've been mixing sedition with smut, hiding radical pamphlets behind dirty covers, testing the limits of what could be printed and sold without getting everyone involved thrown in prison. Now, with revolution in the air, the stakes are higher than ever. New pamphlets appear, Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, smuggled in from printers who are one step ahead of the law. Tracts arguing that common people deserve a voice in their own government. Ideas that would have gotten a man hanged a generation ago, now circulating openly in the shadows of Wych Street. The government cracks down. Spies infiltrate the radical clubs. Printers are arrested. Some of the booksellers on Holywell Street suddenly close up shop, relocate, change their names. The ones who stay learn to be even more careful, burying the dangerous stuff deeper, speaking in code, trusting only customers they've known for years. You stay out of it. Politics isn't your business. You're a carpenter, not a revolutionary, but you can feel the tension in the air, the sense that something fundamental is shifting, that the world your children will inherit might look nothing like the world you were born into. If you have children, if you survive long enough to have anything at all. Mary wants to talk about the future. It's late, after closing time, and you're sitting in the empty tavern while she wipes down tables and counts the night's take. The fire has burned low. The only light comes from a single candle guttering on the bar. What happens when your apprenticeship ends? She asks. You've thought about this. 2 more years and you'll be free. A journeyman carpenter, able to take work where you find it, able to set your own hours, able to save money towards something more. I don't know. Find work, I suppose. Maybe rent a room somewhere. Somewhere near here. The question hangs in the air. You both know what she's really asking. I'd like that, you say, if you would. She doesn't answer right away, just keeps wiping the same spot on the table, over and over, like she's thinking something through. I'm not going to be a barmaid forever, she says finally. I want something more, a shop maybe, or a boarding house, Something that's mine. You nod. You understand. Nobody wants to spend their whole life serving other people's drinks, dealing with other people's problems, sleeping in other people's rooms. We could do that together, you say, someday, when we've saved enough. She looks up, meets your eyes. Together? If you want. The candle flickers. Outside, someone's singing in the street, drunk and off-key but happy. The sounds of Wych Street at midnight, familiar as your own heartbeat. Mary smiles, and you know, without either of you saying it out loud, that something's been decided. Your 6th year of apprenticeship passes in a blur of work and waiting. The master's getting old. His hands shake now when he holds a chisel. His eyes strain to see the fine details that used to come so easily. More and more of the skilled work falls to you, while he handles the business side, talking to customers, negotiating prices, dealing with suppliers. Will's doing well on his own. He's rented a small workshop space in an alley off Drury Lane, taking on jobs that are too small for the bigger establishments. Nothing fancy, but steady. Enough to pay his rent and drink his beer and dream about something better. You help him when you can. Extra hands on big projects. Advice when he's stuck on a tricky joint. The friendship that started in that cramped workshop has grown into something more solid over the years. You trust Will. And in Wych Street, that means something. One afternoon, Will takes you to the Angel Inn. It sits at the very bottom of Wych Street, right where the road meets the Strand. Older than the rising sun, older than most of the buildings around it. The kind of place that's seen centuries of London's history pass through its doors. The sign outside shows an angel with a trumpet, paint faded by decades of London soot. But you can still make out the golden wings. You know about Bishop Hooper? Will asks. You don't. Back in Queen Mary's time, the Catholic Queen, Bloody Mary they called her, and not because of the drink. He takes a long pull from his cup. She burned Protestants for heresy, hundreds of them, men, women, didn't matter. If you wouldn't bow to Rome, you burned. You've heard of Bloody Mary. Everyone has. The Queen who tried to turn England back to Rome and lit fires under anyone who disagreed. Your grandmother used to tell stories, passed down from her grandmother, about the smell of burning flesh that hung over certain towns for days. Hooper was one of them. A bishop himself, actually. Reformed the whole church in Gloucester, they say. Gave away his own money to the poor. And Mary had him arrested for it. Will points at the angel. They kept him here, at this inn, before they took him to Gloucester to burn. Spent his last night in London in that building right there. Probably sat where we're sitting now. You look at the inn with new eyes. The same walls, more or less, that contained a man waiting to die for his beliefs. The same doorway he walked through, knowing he'd never walk through it again. The same street he saw for the last time. These same crowded, filthy, beautiful streets. That was over 200 years ago, Will says. And the inn's still here, still serving beer, still watching people come and go. Hooper's bones are dust. Mary's bones are dust. Everyone who cheered when he burned is dust. But the angel keeps pouring. He's trying to tell you something, you think. Something about permanence. About how the buildings outlast the people. How the street keeps going no matter who lives and dies on it. Or maybe about how little our suffering matters in the long run. How the world just keeps turning. Or maybe he's just drunk and feeling philosophical. Hard to tell with Will sometimes. Inside, the angel is packed. It's a livelier crowd than the rising sun, more mixed. Travellers waiting for coaches, businessmen closing deals, the occasional pickpocket working the room, though you've learned to spot them by now. You order a drink, find a corner, watch the flow of humanity that passes through this ancient space. Somewhere in this room, 200 years ago, a man faced his last night alive, knowing what was coming, knowing there was no escape. And here you are, healthy and young and in love, with your whole future stretching out ahead of you. Funny how history works. The winter of 1790 brings another fever through the neighbourhood. Not you this time, the master. He takes to his bed in November and never really gets up again. The cough that's plagued him for years turns into something worse, something that sounds like his lungs are full of water. His skin goes grey. His breathing rattles in his chest like stones in a tin cup. Some nights you can hear it through the floor, that horrible wet sound, and you lie awake wondering if each breath will be his last. His wife nurses him the way she nursed you, with broth and prayers and cloths soaked in whatever water she can find. She sends for the doctor twice. The first time, he bleeds the master and charges a guinea for the privilege. The second time, he just shakes his head and says to make him comfortable. Make him comfortable, as if comfort exists for a man drowning in his own fluids. By Christmas, he's gone. The funeral is small, a few neighbours, a few customers who remember the old days. Will and you standing in the back of St. Clement Danes trying not to cry. The master wasn't your father, wasn't even particularly kind most days, but he kept you alive, fed you, taught you, gave you a chance when you were just a scared boy off the coach with nothing but hope and ignorance. The workshop falls to his eldest son, a young man about your age who's never shown much interest in carpentry. Always had his eye on something cleaner, something that didn't involve sawdust in your hair and splinters in your fingers. He announces, almost immediately, that he's selling everything and moving to the countryside, wants nothing to do with Wych Street, wants nothing to do with the trade that killed his father slowly, over 30 years of breathing sawdust and bending over workbenches. Which means you're out of a job. You've got 6 months left on your apprenticeship. By rights, you should be transferred to another master, someone who can sign off on your training and grant you journeyman status. But finding someone willing to take on an apprentice with only 6 months to go, someone who'd be doing all the teaching with none of the benefit of your labour, that's not easy. That's nearly impossible, actually. Will comes through. I know a man, he says, friend of a friend. He's got a shop over near Covent Garden, needs help. Might be willing to take you on for the remainder. The man's name is Crawford, older than the master was, but still sharp. He looks you over, asks a few questions, tests your skills with a scrap of wood and a chisel, grunts at the results.
6 months?
Yes, sir. And then you on your own? Yes, sir. He considers, spits into the sawdust on the floor. All right, but I'm not paying you, and you'll work twice as hard as any of my regular boys. You agree. What choice do you have? The next 6 months are brutal. Crawford is a perfectionist in ways the old master never was. He makes you redo work that would have passed anywhere else, criticises every joint, every cut, every finishing touch, drives you to the edge of exhaustion, and then demands more. Again, he says for the 100th time, looking at a dovetail joint you've spent 3 hours perfecting. The gap's too wide, a hair's breadth, but too wide. Do it again. You want to argue, want to point out that nobody would ever notice, that the joint is strong enough, that you're not getting paid for this torture. But you don't, because Crawford isn't wrong. The gap is there if you look close enough, and looking close enough is what separates a craftsman from a man who works with wood. But he's also the best carpenter you've ever seen. His hands are steady, even at his age, even with joints that must ache in the cold. His eye for detail is unmatched. Watching him work is like watching an artist, each movement deliberate, each decision purposeful. He doesn't just make furniture, he makes things that will last for generations, things that will still be beautiful when everyone who remembers him is dead. You learn more in those 6 months than you learned in the previous 6 years. Not just technique, attitude, the difference between good enough and actually good. The pride of knowing that something you made with your own hands is the best it could possibly be. And then, one day in the summer of 1791, it's over. Crawford signs the papers. Doesn't smile, because Crawford never smiles. But there's something in his eyes that might be approval, or at least the absence of disappointment. "You'll do," he says, which from Crawford is basically a standing ovation. You're a journeyman now, free, your own man at last. You walk out of his shop and into the bright July sun, and for a moment you just stand there, letting it sink in. 7 years of your life given over to learning a trade. 7 years of sanding and sawing and sweating and surviving. Done. Mary's waiting for you at the Rising Sun. She's got a bottle of wine, the good stuff, stolen from Cartwright's private stock. You don't ask how she managed it. Just accept the cup she pours and drink it down. "So what now?" she asks. What now indeed? You've got skills and freedom but no money, no tools of your own, no workshop. The streets are full of journeyman carpenters competing for the same jobs. Some of them have been at it for years and still haven't gotten anywhere. But you've got something they don't. You've got 7 years of surviving Wych Street. 7 years of learning how to read people, how to navigate dangerous situations, how to find opportunity in chaos. 7 years of building a network, a community, a reputation as someone who shows up and does the work, and doesn't cause trouble. "I've got some ideas," you say. Mary raises her cup. "To ideas, then." You drink. Outside, the street is doing its thing. Vendors shouting, carts rattling, someone laughing, someone crying, someone singing a song you almost recognise. The eternal circus of Wych Street, carrying on the way it always has, the way it always will. You're part of it now, really part of it, not an apprentice anymore, not someone else's responsibility. A man with a trade, standing on his own 2 feet, ready to build something. Whatever comes next, you'll face it here. In these narrow streets where the buildings lean together like old friends sharing secrets. In these shadows where fortunes are made and lost, and made again. In this strange, dark, beautiful corner of London that's become, against all odds, your home. Close your eyes now. Let the wine warm your belly. Let the sounds of the street sing you to sleep. Tomorrow, the real work begins. But tonight, just tonight, you can rest. You've earned it. You marry Mary on a Tuesday in October, 1792. Nothing fancy. A quick ceremony at St Clement Danes, the old church that sits where Wych Street meets the Strand. The same church where they buried the Master less than 2 years ago. The same church whose bells have marked every hour of your London life, ringing out over the rooftops like a reminder that time keeps moving whether you're ready or not. The building itself has seen better days. Took damage in some war or another, patched up but never quite restored. The tower leans slightly, though the vicar swears it's been leaning that way for a century and hasn't fallen yet. Stone walls black with soot. Windows that were probably beautiful once, before generations of coal smoke dimmed them to murky shadows. Will stands up for you. One of Mary's friends from the Rising Sun, a girl named Agnes who works the kitchen, stands up for her. Cartwright gives Mary the day off, grumbling about it but not really meaning it. Even he can see that a barmaid with a husband is more stable than one without. Less likely to run off, less likely to get into trouble. The vicar rushes through the words like he's got somewhere else to be, which he probably does. 3 other couples are waiting their turn. Tuesdays are popular for weddings, apparently. Something about old superstitions, lucky days, the kind of thing your grandmother might have known about. The ring is silver, not gold. You saved for 3 months to afford it, working extra jobs, skipping meals when you had to. Mary cries when you put it on her finger, and you're not sure if it's happiness or something else. Some mixture of relief and fear that comes with making a choice this permanent. You're both so young, really. 23 years old, and you've committed the rest of your lives to each other. The rest of your lives, however long that might be. After the ceremony, you walk back through the streets together. Your wife now. The word feels strange in your mouth, heavy and light at the same time. Wife. You have a wife. Someone who's chosen to share whatever comes next, good or bad or anything in between. So what now? She asks. The same question she asked when you became a journeyman, the question that seems to follow every change. Now, we build something. You've rented a room, 2 rooms actually, if you count the tiny space in the back that might generously be called a kitchen. It's on the upper floor of a building just off Wych Street, on one of those narrow courts that run between the main thoroughfare and Holywell Street behind it. The court has a name, supposedly, though no one seems to agree on what it is. Some call it Butcher's Yard, after a slaughterhouse that operated here generations ago. Others call it the Rat Run, which is more accurate. A few old-timers insist it's actually called something else entirely, something foreign sounding, but they can't agree on that either. The buildings lean so close together that you could reach out your window and shake hands with your neighbour across the way. The sky is a narrow strip of grey far above, visible only if you crane your neck at exactly the right angle. On sunny days, actual sunlight touches the ground for maybe an hour, around noon, if the angle is right and the clouds cooperate. The rest of the time, it's shadows. The walls are timber and plaster, blackened by centuries of London smoke. Some of them still show the marks of the Great Fire, scorch patterns that somehow survived even though the buildings themselves were rebuilt. It's like living inside history, surrounded by the ghosts of everything that came before. It's dark. It's cramped. The smell from the cesspit in the courtyard below rises up through the floorboards on warm days, a rich stench of human waste mixed with whatever the neighbours have thrown out. The drainage is terrible. After a good rain, the whole courtyard floods, and you have to pick your way through inches of filthy water just to reach the street. The neighbours include a drunk who sings at 3 a.m, old ballads about sailors and lost love that would be touching if they weren't so loud, a prostitute who entertains clients at all hours, her laughter carrying through the thin walls. A family of 8 crammed into a space smaller than your 2 rooms combined. Children everywhere, always hungry, always underfoot. It's yours. For the first time in your life, you have a door you can close, a space that belongs to you and no one else, a place to hang your tools, store your wood, sleep beside your wife without worrying about the master walking in. Home. Another word that feels strange, but good. The work comes slowly at first. You don't have a reputation yet, not as a journeyman. People knew you as the apprentice at the old workshop, the quiet one who showed up and did what he was told. Now you need them to know you as something else, a craftsman in your own right, someone worth hiring. Will helps, sends jobs your way when he's got more than he can handle, recommends you to customers who need work done but can't afford his prices. It's charity, in a way, and you hate needing it. But you take it anyway, because pride is a luxury you can't afford. The jobs are small at first. Fixing a broken chair leg, replacing a worn-out tabletop. The kind of repairs that barely pay enough to cover the cost of materials, let alone your time, but you do them well. Better than well. Crawford's voice echoes in your head every time you pick up a tool. Again. The gap's too wide. Do it again. Word spreads. The way word always does in places like this. Slowly, through whispers and recommendations, through customers who tell their friends about the young carpenter in the rat run who charges fair prices and does good work. By the spring of '93, you've got more jobs than you can handle. Then, war comes. England against France. The revolution that everyone's been watching, arguing about, celebrating or fearing depending on their politics, has finally spilled over into open conflict. The French executed their king in January, strapped him to a board and dropped a blade on his neck in front of a cheering crowd. The king they executed wasn't just any king. He was married to an Austrian princess. He had allies all over Europe. And now, those allies are fighting back, and England has joined them. The news travels through the taverns like fire. At the Rising Sun, men argue about whether it's right or wrong, necessary or foolish. The war will be over by Christmas, some say. Others shake their heads and talk about the last wars with France, how they dragged on for years, how they bankrupted the country and killed a generation. Nobody knows what's coming, but everybody feels it coming anyway. The war changes everything. Trade slows. Ships that used to carry goods back and forth across the channel now carry soldiers and cannons instead. Merchant vessels stay in port, afraid of French privateers, afraid of being pressed into naval service. The docks that kept London alive with imports and exports grow quieter, emptier. Men who made their living loading and unloading cargo find themselves without work. Prices rise for everything, especially wood. The good oak and mahogany that wealthy customers expect becomes scarce, expensive, sometimes impossible to find. Navy ships need timber, lots of timber. The shipyards gobble up supplies that would have gone to furniture makers, cabinet makers, anyone who works with wood. You learn to work with lesser materials, to make cheap wood look better than it is, to stretch your supplies as far as they'll go. Some of the other carpenters give up, go back to wherever they came from, or take jobs in the shipyards where the Navy is desperate for hands. The ones who stay compete more fiercely for what work remains. Prices drop even as costs rise. It's a squeeze that crushes the weak and the unlucky. You survive. Barely. Because you know how to survive. Because Wych Street taught you that. Mary keeps working at the Rising Sun, even after the wedding. You'd both hoped she could stop, focus on making your rooms into a real home, maybe start thinking about children. But the money isn't there. Every penny goes to rent, food, materials. The savings you'd planned to build never quite materialise. She comes home tired most nights, smelling of beer and smoke, her feet aching from hours of standing. You rub them sometimes, in the dark, while she tells you about the customers and the gossip and the small dramas that play out every night in that crowded room. Cartwright's getting old, she says. Talks about selling up, the way the previous owner did. Nobody knows who might buy the Rising Sun next, what changes might come. The uncertainty hangs over everything, but there are good moments too. Sunday mornings, when neither of you has to work, and you can lie in bed listening to the church bells and pretending the world outside doesn't exist. Meals shared at the tiny table you built yourself, your first real piece of furniture, made from scraps of oak you salvaged from a demolished building. Walks through the streets in the evening, arm in arm, watching the lamplighters make their rounds, the city transforming from day to night. You learn the neighbourhood differently now, as a resident instead of an apprentice. Learn which vendors give honest weight and which shave a little off every purchase. Learn which streets are safe at what hours, where the footpads lurk, where the watchmen actually patrol instead of just pretending to. Learn the rhythms of the courts and alleys, who lives where, who can be trusted, who should be avoided. The narrow spaces between Wych Street and Holywell Street have their own ecosystem. A whole world hidden from the main thoroughfares, where the light barely penetrates and the rules are different. You hear stories about what happens in some of those courts. Gambling dens that operate all night. Fences who'll buy anything, no questions asked. Women who'll do anything for the right price. Men who'll do worse. A historian might call it degraded, degenerated, infamous even. You call it home. One evening, walking back from a job, you pass the old site of Lyons Inn. There's a theatre there now. The Globe, they call it, though it's got nothing to do with Shakespeare's original except the name. The first Globe burned down almost 200 years ago, during a performance of Henry VIII, when a cannon misfired and set the thatch roof ablaze. The second was torn down by Puritans who thought theatre was sinful. This is the third theatre to bear that title, built on the bones of the old Inn of Chancery, where lawyers used to live and learn their trade. The lawyers are long gone. The building where Thomas More once studied is dust. In its place, entertainment for the masses, plays and spectacles and whatever else will fill seats and empty pockets. The crowds that gather outside are a mixed lot, wealthy gentlemen in fine coats rubbing shoulders with apprentices and shopkeepers and women of uncertain reputation. You remember Will telling you about this, years ago, how the Inns of Chancery used to be grand institutions, training grounds for men who would argue cases before the king's own courts, how they fell into disrepair over the centuries, attracted gamblers and swindlers and men about town who had nothing better to do, how one historian wrote that the whole area between Wych Street and Holywell Street had witnessed scenes of the most disgraceful and infamous character. Disgraceful, infamous. Strong words for a place you call home. Lyons Inn was demolished to make way for the Globe. The new inn, where More studied, still stands, but barely. The whole system that trained England's lawyers for centuries is crumbling, piece by piece, replaced by taverns and theatres and whatever else the modern age demands. Progress, some would call it. You're not sure what to call it. But you feel something watching the crowd stream into the Globe for the evening's performance. Something like sadness, maybe. Or just the awareness that nothing lasts. Not the lawyers, not the inns, not even this theatre, probably, which will stand until someone decides to tear it down and build something else. The only constant is change and survival. Mary tells you she's pregnant in the winter of '94. You're sitting by the fire, such as it is, a small coal brazier that costs too much to feed and gives off too little heat. She's mending a shirt, squinting in the dim light, and she says it casually, like she's commenting on the weather. I think I'm going to have a baby. The needle stops. She looks up at you, waiting. You don't know what to feel. Joy? Fear? Both, probably, tangled together so tightly you can't separate them. A child. Your child. A new life in this old, tired, dirty city. Are you sure? Pretty sure. The signs are all there. You've seen women die in childbirth, seen them bleed out in hours, screaming until they couldn't scream anymore, seen children die in infancy, carried off by fevers and fluxes before they could even walk, before they had names that anyone would remember, seen families destroyed by the simple act of trying to bring new life into the world. It happens all the time in places like this. Part of life. Part of the price you pay for living at all. But you've also seen the other side. Children who survive, who grow strong, who carry on their parents' names and trades and dreams. We'll manage, you say, because what else can you say? Mary smiles, goes back to her mending. Outside, the wind howls through the narrow court, rattling the windows in their frames. Somewhere a dog is barking. Somewhere a baby is crying. Someone else's baby, not yet yours, but soon. You put another piece of coal on the brazier, watch the flames dance. A child. God help you. God help all of you. Let your eyes grow heavy now. Feel the warmth of the fire, even if it's just a memory of warmth, just the idea of it. The war goes on. The work goes on. Life goes on, stubborn and relentless, refusing to stop no matter how hard things get. You've built something here. Not much, by some standards. 2 rooms in a rat run, a wife who works too hard, a child on the way you're not sure you can afford. But it's yours, and that's something. That's everything, really. Sleep now. The morning will bring what it brings. Your daughter is born in the summer of 1795. It happens in your 2 rooms above the rat run, with Mary gripping your hand hard enough to leave bruises. A midwife from 3 doors down does the work. Old woman, been delivering babies in this neighbourhood for 40 years. She's seen everything. The ones who live, the ones who don't. She knows what she's doing. The labour takes 12 hours. 12 hours of Mary's screaming, of you feeling useless, of praying to a God you're not sure you believe in anymore. The midwife sends you out for hot water, sends you out for clean rags, sends you out for gin, which she drinks herself because, she says, it steadies her hands. When the crying starts, thin and high and miraculous, she wraps the baby in a cloth and hands her to Mary like she's done this 1,000 times, which she probably has. Girl, she says, strong lungs, good colour, she'll live. Those last 2 words mean more than anything else she could say. She'll live. So many don't. You've seen the tiny coffins carried through these streets, seen mothers weeping over bundles barely bigger than loaves of bread, seen fathers drinking themselves into oblivion because the child they hoped for never drew a second breath. But your daughter is breathing, screaming actually, red-faced and furious at being forced into this cold, dirty world. You look at this small, squalling thing, your daughter, your blood, a new person in the world who didn't exist yesterday and exists now, somehow, against all odds. Mary's exhausted, pale as milk, lost a lot of blood, more than the midwife expected. But she's smiling. She needs a name, she says. You hadn't thought that far ahead, honestly. The pregnancy itself was enough to worry about. The money, the space, whether Mary would survive the birth, whether the baby would survive its first week. So many don't. So many don't. Elizabeth, you say. It was your mother's name. Mary nods, closes her eyes, sleeps. You sit by the window with Elizabeth in your arms, watching the sun set over the rooftops of Wych Street. The buildings lean against each other like old drunks holding each other up. Some of them have stood for 200 years, older than memory, older than the country you're fighting a war against, older than everything, except the river and the hills. These are Elizabethan houses, named for the Queen who ruled when they were built. Timber frames filled with plaster, the beams darkened by 2 centuries of London smoke, upper floors that jut out over the street on wooden brackets, each floor extending further than the one below it, until the buildings almost touch at the top. They call it jettying, something about gaining extra space, extra rooms, extra rent. The old builders were clever like that. They found ways to squeeze every last inch of usefulness out of narrow plots and crooked streets. Some people say the upper floors were designed to make it easier to empty chamber pots into the street. Others say it was about keeping the lower floors dry when it rained. Nobody really knows anymore. The builders who put up these houses are long dead. Their grandchildren are dead. Their grandchildren's grandchildren are dead. But the houses remain. They survived the Great Fire somehow. Everything around Drury Lane stayed standing while the rest of London burned. A miracle, some said. A fluke of the wind, more likely. The fire came roaring up from Pudding Lane in 1666, ate through thousands of buildings, destroyed 87 churches, left 2/3 of the city in ashes. But it stopped just short of here. The flames turned, the wind shifted, and these old houses, built of wood and plaster, somehow escaped the inferno that consumed their stone neighbours. You think about that sometimes, the luck of it, the strange fortune that kept this particular collection of buildings standing while an entire city burned around them. If the wind had blown different that day, none of this would be here. The rising sun, the George, the narrow courts where you learn to survive, all of it would be gone, replaced by whatever London built in its place after the fire. You hold Elizabeth up to the window. "See that?" you whisper. "That's where you live now. That's home." She has no idea what you're saying. She's less than an hour old. But you say it anyway. The first year is the hardest. Elizabeth cries constantly. Your sleep, already thin, becomes non-existent. Mary recovers slowly, takes a few months off from the rising sun, then has to go back because you need the money. You take on every job you can find, working dawn to midnight, trying to build something like savings. The war drags on. Napoleon rises in France. The world keeps turning. None of it matters much when you're trying to figure out how to feed a baby on wages that barely covered 2 adults. Will helps when you can, sends small jobs your way, watches Elizabeth sometimes when you and Mary both have to work. He's good with her. Surprising, for a man who never had children of his own. Maybe because of that. Old Peters dies in the winter of 96. Heart gave out in the rising sun, right at the bar, tankard still in his hand. They say that's how he would have wanted to go. You're not sure anyone wants to go at all, but if you have to, that's probably not the worst way. Margaret the match seller keeps on. She must be ancient now, 100 years old if she's a day, but she's still in her spot every morning, still selling her wares, still knowing everyone's secrets. You wonder sometimes what she knows about you. Young Danny finishes his apprenticeship with the butcher, sets up his own stall, gets married to a girl from Covent Garden. Life goes on. Elizabeth grows. She learns to crawl in those cramped rooms, dodging furniture and sawdust and the various tools of your trade. She learns to walk by holding onto the table you built, the one made from salvaged oak. She says her first words, "Mama," and "Da," and then, mysteriously, "Moon," which makes no sense until you realise she can see the Crescent shop sign on Holywell Street from the back window. The Crescent Moon, one of the oldest shop signs in London, hanging over a bookshop that's been there longer than anyone remembers. Gold paint faded by generations of soot. Elizabeth points at it every evening, when the light catches it just right. "Moon," she says. "That's right," you tell her. Moon. By the time she's 3, Elizabeth is running through the streets like she owns them, playing with the other children in the courts and alleys, learning, as you learned, which corners are safe and which aren't, which shopkeepers will slip her a treat and which will chase her away, how to move through the crowd without getting trampled, how to disappear into a doorway when trouble comes walking by. She's a child of Wych Street now, this narrow, dark, dirty, Wonderful place is all she knows. The leaning buildings with their timber frames, the smell of coal smoke and horse dung, and whatever's cooking in the dozens of stalls, the sound of the church bells at St. Clement Danes, marking the hours, the feel of cobblestones under bare feet, worn smooth by centuries of traffic. She doesn't know there's another London, a London of grand houses and clean streets and people who bathe more than once a month, a London where children have nurseries and governesses and rooms of their own. That London exists just a few hundred yards away on the Strand, but it might as well be on the moon for all Elizabeth will never see of it. This is her world, these crooked streets and shadowed alleys, these ancient houses that have sheltered generations of Londoners just like her, this community of survivors and dreamers and schemers who call themselves neighbours. You wouldn't have it any other way. The buildings themselves become familiar, not just as background, but as characters in the story of your life. There's the house on the corner where the drunk sings every night, 3 stories of timber and plaster, listing slightly to the east, held up apparently by nothing but habit. The woman who lives on the top floor keeps pigeons on the roof. You can hear them cooing when the street goes quiet. There's the old pub that used to be something else. Nobody remembers what. Its sign creaks in the wind. Its windows haven't been cleaned since the old king was young. But the beer is cheap and the company is reliable. And sometimes that's all you need. There's the shop where they sell the books you're not supposed to look at. You've never gone in, never needed to, but you know what happens behind that door. The mixing of sedition and smut, the revolutionary pamphlets hidden behind illustrated covers. The shopkeeper nods when you pass. You nod back. That's the extent of your interaction. And there's your building. 4 stories of questionable construction, housing maybe 20 people across various rooms and partitions, the cesspit in the courtyard below, the narrow staircase that groans with every step, the window where you can see the crescent moon sign if you lean out just right. This is architecture that survives not because it's well built, but because nobody's gotten around to tearing it down yet. Architecture that's been patched and repaired and subdivided so many times that the original builders wouldn't recognise it. Architecture that was old when your grandparents were born and will probably still be standing when your grandchildren die, unless someone decides to make way for something new. There's beauty in it, if you know where to look. The way the timber frames pattern against the plaster, the way the upper floors create shelter from rain and sun alike, the way the buildings lean together, as if they're sharing secrets. A writer came through here once, years ago, taking notes on everything he saw, gathering material for a story, he said. You wonder sometimes what he made of it, whether he found the beauty or just the squalor, whether he understood that this place, for all its faults, is home to people who love it. The war ends in 1815, 22 years of fighting, and finally, it's over. Napoleon's beaten at Waterloo. The French are no longer the enemy. England celebrates with bonfires and parades and drinking that lasts for days. The bells at St. Clement Danes ring all night. People dance in the streets of Wych Street, the same streets where they once feared invasion, feared conscription, feared the end of everything they knew. You're 46 now, grey in your hair, ache in your joints when the weather turns cold, lines in your face that weren't there when you stepped off that coach 32 years ago, a frightened boy from the country with nothing but hope and ignorance, but still working, still surviving, still here. Your hands have shaped 1,000 pieces of furniture over the years, tables and chairs and cabinets for people you'll never meet. Your work sits in houses across London, in homes rich and poor. Some of it will outlast you. Some of it already has outlasted you, in a way. The things you made in your 20s are still being used, still holding up, while your own body slowly wears down. That's something, you think, to make things that last, to leave something behind, besides memories. Elizabeth is 20, grown into a young woman who moves through Wych Street with the same confidence you developed over decades. She works at the Rising Sun now, like her mother before her. Cartwright's long gone, sold up and moved to the country years ago. The place is owned by someone else now, a man named Fletcher who's decent enough. The beer is still cheap and the songs are still filthy on Saturday nights. Some things never change. Mary's still with you, still sharing those 2 rooms above the rat run. Her hair has grey in it too. Her hands are rough from years of work, but her smile is the same. Her eyes still find you across a crowded room like you're the only person there. Will died a few years back, quietly, in his sleep, which is more than most people in this neighbourhood can hope for. You helped bury him in the churchyard at St Clement Danes, stood there in the rain, remembering the boy who taught you how to survive this place, wondering if he'd be proud of what you've become. The neighbourhood is changing, you think, or maybe you're just old enough now to notice change happening. There are more buildings going up, more people crowding in. The narrow streets that once felt cosy now feel cramped. The old houses that once felt solid now feel fragile. You hear talk sometimes of improvements, of widening roads, of tearing down the old to make way for the new. Nothing happens yet. The talk remains talk, but you can feel something shifting. The world is moving faster now. Coaches and carriages, steam engines in the factories. Progress, they call it. Progress and improvement and the march of civilization. You're not sure what that means for places like Wych Street, for buildings that have stood for 2 centuries, for communities that have grown up in the shadows of those buildings, for people like you who've spent their whole lives in these narrow lanes. But that's a worry for another day. Tonight, you're home. Elizabeth brought her young man to dinner, a cooper's apprentice from Drury Lane. Seems decent enough. Nervous around you, which is probably healthy. Mary likes him. That's usually a good sign. You eat together in the small room, bread and cheese and some cold meat from the market. Nothing fancy, but enough. The candle burns low. Outside, the sounds of the evening continue. Someone laughing, someone singing, the eternal rhythm of Wych Street at night. After they leave, you and Mary sit by the window, looking out at the rooftops, the leaning buildings, the crescent moon sign catching the last of the light. "We did all right," she says. You think about everything that's happened, the fever that nearly killed you, the war that nearly broke you, the child you raised in 2 cramped rooms above a stinking courtyard, the years of work and worry and hope. Yeah, you say, we did all right. Close your eyes now. Feel the familiar weight of all those years, all those memories, all those people you've known and loved and lost. The buildings lean together in the dark, ancient, tired, still standing, like you. Let sleep find you. You've earned another night of rest. You die in the winter of 1842, peacefully, in your sleep, in the same 2 rooms above the rat run where you've lived for 50 years. Mary went 3 winters before. You've been waiting to follow her ever since. Not impatiently, just waiting. The way you wait for spring when winter drags on too long. Elizabeth finds you in the morning, cold, still, a faint smile on your face, as if you were dreaming of something pleasant. Maybe you were dreaming of Mary. Maybe you were dreaming of your first day in London, stepping off that coach into the chaos. Maybe you were dreaming of nothing at all, which is its own kind of peace. She cries, of course, but not too much. Not the way she would have cried 20 years ago. You are 73 years old, which is ancient by the standards of this neighbourhood. You outlived your master, outlived Will, outlived most of the people you knew when you first arrived as a frightened boy from the country. You outlived the world you were born into. They bury you at St. Clement Danes, next to Mary. The vicar says some words. Elizabeth and her husband and their children stand in the rain. A few old neighbours who remember you, though not many. The bells toll, as they've tolled for centuries, as they'll toll for decades more until the bombs of another war silence them. But that's a story for someone else to tell. Your story ends here, in a churchyard, in the rain, in the heart of the neighbourhood you learned to love. Sleep now. You've earned it. The years pass. Elizabeth grows old in the same rooms where you raised her. Her children grow up. Her grandchildren are born. The world changes around them in ways you couldn't have imagined. The railroad comes to London in the 1830s and 40s. Great iron tracks cutting through neighbourhoods, displacing thousands, reshaping the city. The stations rise like cathedrals of steam and steel. Euston, King's Cross, Paddington. People can travel in hours what used to take days. Wych Street watches all this from a distance. The trains don't come here. The narrow lanes and ancient buildings aren't suited for progress on that scale. But the world is speeding up, and Wych Street is standing still. Queen Victoria takes the throne in 1837, a young woman, barely 18, inheriting an empire that spans the globe. Her reign will last 63 years, long enough to give her name to an entire age. The Victorian age brings changes that nobody could have predicted. Gas lamps replace candles and oil. The streets get brighter at night, though not much safer. The Metropolitan Police, established in 1829, patrol in their dark blue uniforms, trying to impose order on the chaos. The old watch, drunk and corrupt as they were, fade into memory. The population explodes. When you arrived in 1783, London held maybe 700,000 souls. By the middle of the Victorian era, it's approaching 3 million. By the end, over 6 million. The largest city the world has ever seen. More people than ancient Rome at its height. More people than any city has ever held before. All those people need somewhere to live, need streets to walk on, need room to breathe, need sewers that work and water that's clean and air that doesn't kill them slowly with every breath. Wych Street has none of these things to offer. The old Elizabethan houses, the ones that survived the Great Fire, are showing their age now. 300 years of settling and shifting, 300 years of repairs piled on repairs. The timber frames are rotten in places, eaten through by beetles and damp. The plaster is crumbling, falling in chunks onto the street below. The foundations, never solid to begin with, are sinking into London's clay. The upper floors still jut out over the street, blocking the light. But what once seemed charming now seems oppressive. The narrow lanes that once felt cosy now feel cramped. The darkness that once provided cover now just hides the filth. A contemporary account describes the area as having narrow, dark, and irregular alleyways encumbered with low projecting eaves and arched doorways. Good for ambush, good for hiding, bad for everything else. Reformers start asking questions. Why do people live like this? Why are the streets so narrow? Why is there no drainage, no clean water, no air that doesn't stink of cesspits and coal smoke? The answers are complicated, rooted in centuries of neglect and poverty, but the solutions, to the Victorian mind, are simple. Tear it down. Build something better. Call it progress. They start with the rookeries. St Giles goes first, carved up by New Oxford Street in 1847. 5,000 people displaced overnight. Nobody asks where they'll go. Nobody cares. The slum is gone, and that's what matters. Wych Street watches, waits. The same conversations that doomed St Giles are starting to circle around these streets too. Elizabeth dies in 1871, 76 years old. Her granddaughter, also named Elizabeth, inherits the rooms above the Rat Run. Fourth generation to call this place home. The younger Elizabeth is different from her grandmother. She can read and write. She's seen things the older generation couldn't imagine. Photography, telegraphs. The Underground Railway opened in 1863, running trains beneath the streets of London. The world is changing faster than anyone can keep up with. One day in 1876, a man comes to Wych Street with a camera. Not just any camera, a large wooden box on a tripod, requiring plates of glass coated with chemicals, requiring the subject to hold perfectly still while the image burns itself onto the plate. Photography is still a complicated business, more art than science. The exposure takes several seconds. Any movement blurs the image into ghosts. The man works for something called the Society for Photographing Relics of Old London, a group of antiquarians and historians who've realised something that the city planners haven't. These old buildings, these ancient streets, these remnants of a London that existed before the Great Fire, are disappearing. And once they're gone forever, unless someone captures them first. His job is to create a permanent record of what was, before it becomes what will be. A visual archive of threatened buildings, a way to remember what progress will erase. He sets up his camera on Wych Street, adjusts the lens, slides in the glass plate, coated with its light-sensitive chemicals, removes the cap. For several seconds, the street holds its breath. The shutter closes. The image is captured. The old houses with their jettied upper floors, the crooked doorways, the shop signs weathered by generations of soot, all of it frozen in silvering light, fixed forever on a glass plate that will outlast the buildings themselves by more than a century. The photograph still exists, if you know where to look. It's in the London Museum now, a window into a vanished world. The buildings lean together like old friends sharing secrets. The street is empty, cleared for the long exposure, but you can almost see the ghosts of everyone who ever walked there. The apprentices and the thieves, the booksellers and the barmaids, the dreamers and the schemers. All of them caught in that moment, preserved forever in shades of grey. Elizabeth watches the photographer pack up his equipment, the wooden tripod, the glass plates in their protective cases, the black cloth he used to shield the lens. She knows what it means. You don't photograph something unless you're afraid it won't be there tomorrow. The talk gets louder as the century wears on. The streets are too narrow for modern traffic. Carriages can barely pass. The buildings are too old, too decrepit, too dangerous. The courts and alleys are breeding grounds for disease. Cholera swept through London in 1854, killing thousands. The Great Stink of 1858 made the Thames so foul that Parliament couldn't meet. Something has to be done. The London County Council, created in 1889, starts making plans. Grand plans. Modern plans. Wide boulevards like Paris. Grand buildings of Portland stone and red brick. A new street called Kingsway, driving straight through the heart of the old neighbourhood. Another called Aldwych, curving around where Wych Street used to be. The old streets are in the way. They'll have to go. Elizabeth's granddaughter, the third Elizabeth, reads about the plans in the newspaper, compulsory purchase orders, demolition schedules, relocation notices. The language is dry and bureaucratic, but the meaning is clear. They're going to tear it down. All of it. Every house, every shop, every tavern that stood here since the old queen with the red hair sat on the throne. Gone, as if it never existed. She walks through the neighbourhood that evening, past the rising sun, where her great-great-grandmother once worked, past the crescent moon sign on Holywell Street, faded now but still hanging, past the spot where the Globe Theatre used to stand, before it was torn down for something newer. The buildings lean together in the gathering dark, 300 years old and still standing, survivors of the great fire that destroyed everything around them, survivors of plague and poverty and progress, but not survivors of this. There's something called a listed building now, a way to protect places of historical importance from demolition, but it's too new, too weak, too late. Nobody thinks to protect Wych Street. It's just a slum, after all. Just narrow lanes and old houses and shadows. Nothing worth saving. The demolition begins in the last years of the 19th century. Crews with pickaxes and crowbars, carts to haul away the rubble, dust rising in clouds as timber and plaster give way to brute force. The buildings that survived the Great Fire of 1666 don't survive the London County Council of 1899. One by one, they come down. The houses where families lived for generations, where children were born and old people died, where the same floorboards creaked under the feet of great-grandparents and great-grandchildren, the shops where books were sold, legal and otherwise, where revolutionaries browsed next to pornographers, where ideas that would change the world sat on shelves next to pictures that would make a bishop faint. The taverns where songs were sung and stories were told, where deals were made and hearts were broken, where the bar wenches belted out filthy verses on Saturday nights to the great amusement of the crowd. All of it. Gone. The theatres go too. The Olympic, built from the timbers of a French warship. The Globe, third of 5 theatres to bear that name, built on the site where lawyers once studied. The Opera Comique, the Gaiety, all of them demolished to make way for the new Aldwych. The crescent moon sign comes down from Holywell Street, the oldest shop sign in London, some said. Nobody thinks to save it. It's just a piece of painted wood, after all. Just a memory, hanging on a wall that won't be there tomorrow. The third Elizabeth moves to Islington, rents a room in a building made of brick, with proper drains and gas lighting and all the modern conveniences. It's safer, cleaner, more respectable. But at night, sometimes, she dreams of narrow streets and leaning buildings, of a crescent moon sign catching the light, of the sound of bells from St. Clement Danes, marking the hours as they've marked them for 500 years. She dreams of a place that no longer exists. By 1901, Wych Street is gone. Where the narrow lanes used to wind, there's now a broad curve of road called Aldwych. Where the old houses used to lean, there are grand new buildings of stone and brick. Australia House, India House, Bush House, which will one day hold the BBC. The kind of imperial architecture that announces to the world, this is the heart of an empire. This is progress. This is modern. The old neighbourhood is buried beneath. Not just demolished, but erased. Even the street names are changed. Even the memory is paved over. A person could walk through that curved new road and never know what used to stand there. Never guess that beneath their feet, in some metaphorical sense, lies the ghost of one of London's most storied neighbourhoods. The narrow streets where Jack Sheppard learned his trade before turning to crime. The bookshops where sedition and smut were sold side by side, revolution hiding behind pornography. the taverns where songs were sung that would make a sailor blush and a vicar faint, the coffee houses where men like Samuel Johnson held court and con men like Henry Perfect found their marks, the music shop where a young German immigrant named Astor sold flutes before sailing to America to become its first multimillionaire. All of it gone, replaced by stone and steel and progress, replaced by the grand curve of Aldwych, which ironically takes its name from the old neighbourhood it destroyed. Aldwych, Aldwych, Old Wych Street, the new road named for the old road it erased. But maybe not entirely gone. The photographs survive, the old maps survive, the stories survive, passed down through generations, written in books and archives and memories. The neighbourhood is gone, but the idea of it persists. The knowledge that once, in this exact spot, people lived and loved and struggled and survived. People who were no different from you. People who wanted the same things you want. A home, a family, a life that means something. That's something, isn't it? You arrived in 1783, a frightened boy from the country, stepping off a coach into the chaos of London. You learned to survive in streets so narrow the sun barely reached the ground. You learned to recognise the footpaths and avoid the cesspits and find your way through fog so thick you could taste it. You fell in love, raised a daughter, built furniture that probably outlasted you, sitting in houses across London, holding up the lives of people who never knew your name. And when you died, you were home. The buildings are gone now. The streets are gone. Even the church where you're buried was bombed in the next war and rebuilt, different from before. Even the stones that marked your grave are lost somewhere in the rubble of history. But you were here. You lived. You mattered. And somewhere, in the photographs and the stories and the dreams of people who never knew you, you still do. Close your eyes now. Let the images fade. The leaning buildings, the narrow streets, the crescent moon sign. Let them sink into the darkness, where dreams live. You've walked through history tonight, through a vanished world, through streets that existed for 3 centuries and then disappeared in the space of a few years. Sleep now. Dream of narrow streets and ancient buildings. Dream of a London that was. If you went to London tomorrow, if you flew across the ocean or took a train through the tunnel, or however people travel these days, if you walked down the Strand from Trafalgar Square, past the grand hotels and the theatres and the shops selling things you don't need at prices you can't afford, if you turned left at St Clement Danes, that old church with the bells that still ring out the hours, and looked at the curved road sweeping around to your right, you'd see Aldwych. It's a strange shape on a map, almost like a letter D bulging out from the straight line of the Strand. Some people call it the crescent, others just call it the curve. Whatever you call it, it's distinctive, the kind of road that makes you think someone planned it that way for a reason. And they did. They planned it to replace something else, something older, something that had been there for 300 years, before the planners decided it was in the way. The grand buildings lining the curve look like they've been there forever. Portland stone and red brick, columns and cornices, the kind of architecture that announces importance. Australia House, with its bronze statues and its grand facade, houses the Australian High Commission. India House does the same for India. Bush House, that massive stone block in the middle, used to be the headquarters of the BBC World Service. For decades, voices went out from that building to every corner of the planet, broadcasting news and music and stories to people who would never see London with their own eyes. Kingsway runs north from the curve, driving a straight line through what used to be a maze of medieval alleys. It connects Aldwych to Holborn, business-focused and practical, just as the planners intended. The divide it created still holds true today. Vibrant Covent Garden to the west, the legal courts and financial offices to the east, a boundary drawn in stone and asphalt, where crooked lanes used to wind. If you ask anyone who works in those buildings, anyone who walks past them every day on their way to somewhere else, what used to stand here before, most of them won't know. They'll shrug. They'll say it's always been this way, hasn't it? The curve, the stone, the sense of permanence. But it hasn't, not even close. Just over 100 years ago, those busy people hurrying past would have been walking down narrow medieval lanes. Lanes so narrow, the sun barely reached the ground. Lanes lined with timber-framed houses, whose upper floors jutted out so far they nearly touched across the street. Lanes that had been there since the time of Elizabeth I, surviving fire and plague and revolution and war. The ghost of that world is still there, if you know how to look. There's a tube station nearby, Aldwych Station, they called it, though it's been closed since 1994. You might have seen it in films. Hollywood loves it. Something about the abandoned platforms, the dusty tunnels, the sense of a world beneath the world. They use it for period pieces mostly, for scenes set in old London, in a time before everything got modern and clean and bright. The station exists in a strange twilight, open only for film crews and heritage tours. A ghost station, haunting the ghost of a neighbourhood. The station was built in 1907, just a few years after Wych Street was demolished, built to serve the new development, the grand new buildings, the grand new road. But the area never got busy enough to justify keeping it open. Not enough passengers, not enough life. The commuters who might have filled those platforms, the workers and shopkeepers and ordinary people, they'd already been displaced, moved on to other neighbourhoods, other lives. There's a metaphor in there somewhere, a tube station built on the grave of a neighbourhood, closing down because nobody comes, because the life that made this place special was already gone before the station opened. But that's probably reading too much into it. Charles Dickens knew these streets. Not our protagonist's story, obviously. Dickens was born in 1812, 30 years after our frightened apprentice arrived. But Dickens walked these lanes, worked nearby as a young man, in a blacking factory by the Thames, pasting labels onto bottles while his father sat in debtor's prison. He knew poverty, knew the shame of it, knew how it felt to be young and scared in a city that didn't care whether you lived or died. He came back later, as a writer, gathering material for the stories that would make him famous. Walked through St Giles and worse slums, guided by police inspectors who carried lanterns into the darkest rookeries. Took notes, asked questions, remembered. They say Wych Street inspired parts of Bleak House, the narrow alleys, the jettied buildings, the sense of a world crammed together, pressing in on itself, struggling to breathe. The courts and passages where fog gathered and never quite lifted, where poverty and crime lived side by side with art and commerce and dreams, where the smoke from 1,000 chimneys mixed with the mist from the Thames to create something that was neither fog nor smoke, but a third thing entirely. A London particular, they called it. Dickens wrote about it better than anyone. Dickens had a gift for seeing the life in places like this. Not just the squalor, though he saw that too, but the humanity, the people trying to survive in conditions that would crush someone weaker, the small kindnesses, and the large cruelties. The way a neighbourhood could be a prison and a home at the same time. He wrote about places like Wych Street because he understood that the poor have stories too, that a thief can be a hero, that a barmaid can be brave, that the people history forgets were once just as alive as the kings and queens that history remembers. The streets are gone now, the buildings are gone, but Dickens's words survive. And in those words, something of the old neighbourhood lives on. Not accurately, maybe. Fiction never is, but truthfully, in a way that matters more than accuracy. You've walked through that world tonight, in your imagination, in the spaces between sleep and waking. You've smelled the coal smoke and the horse dung and the Thames at low tide. You've felt the rough wool blankets and the hard straw pallets and the splinters from unfinished wood. You've heard the bells of St. Clement Danes marking the hours, the same bells that mark them still. You've tasted the weak beer and the stale bread and the hope that tomorrow might be better than today. You've met a frightened boy stepping off a coach in 1783, watched him learn to survive in streets where survival was never guaranteed, watched him fall in love, raise a family, build a life in streets so narrow the buildings touched overhead, watched him grow old and die, and be buried in a churchyard that was bombed in another war and rebuilt again. You've seen Jack Sheppard slip through a second-story window, grinning, heading off to meet his fate at Tyburn. Seen Samuel Johnson holding court at the George Inn, drinking coffee and arguing about words. Seen the bar wenches of the Crooked Billet belting out songs that would make a vicar faint. You've watched a photographer set up his camera in 1876, capturing images of buildings that won't be there in 20 years. Watched the demolition crews arrive with their pickaxes and their carts. Watched the dust rise as 3 centuries of history came crashing down. All of it. Every moment. Every life. Every story. Gone now. Except in memory. Except in words. Except in the imagination of people like you, lying in the dark, listening to tales of a world that vanished before your grandparents were born. That's the strange thing about the past, isn't it? It's always there, beneath our feet. Every street we walk on was walked on by someone else before. Every building we enter was built on the foundation of something older. Every city is a palimpsest, layers upon layers of human lives, scraped away and written over again and again. Wych Street is gone, but the ground is still there. The same clay that held the foundations of those old timber houses now holds the foundations of Australia House. The same earth that absorbed the blood of executions and the tears of lovers and the sweat of workers absorbs the footsteps of tourists and office workers and people hurrying to catch a bus. The people who walk there today don't know, don't think about it. Why would they? They have their own lives, their own worries, their own stories to live. They don't have time to wonder about the ghosts beneath their feet. But the ghosts are there, always there. The frightened apprentice and the celebrity thief and the barmaid who dreamed of something better. The master carpenter who taught his trade and died of fever. The children who played in the courts and alleys, some of whom grew up and some of whom didn't. The lovers who met in taverns and the criminals who plotted in shadows, and the ordinary people who just wanted to get through another day. They lived, they mattered, and now they sleep. Like you should be sleeping. Feel the weight of your blankets, so much softer than the rough wool that covered our protagonist on those cold nights in the workshop. Feel the mattress beneath you, so much kinder than a pallet of straw in a corner. You have clean water by your bed, maybe. You have heat that doesn't require stoking a fire. You have light at the touch of a switch. You have safety, more or less. comfort, more or less. A life that people in 1783 couldn't have imagined. They struggled so you could rest. Not you specifically, maybe, but people like them. Generations of people who worked and suffered and survived, building the world that you inherited, laying the foundations, even as those foundations were demolished and replaced and built over again. You owe them something. Not much, just a moment of remembrance, just an acknowledgement that they were here, that they lived, that their lives, however brief, however hard, however forgotten, mattered. You've given them that tonight, by listening, by imagining, by letting their stories into your dreams. That's enough. That's more than most people do. Now, let go. Let the images fade. The leaning buildings and the narrow streets, the crescent moon sign and the rising sun tavern, the fog and the filth and the fear and the hope. Let it all sink into the darkness where dreams live and memories rest. Wych Street has been gone for more than a century. The people who lived there are gone even longer, but stories have a strange kind of permanence. They survive when buildings fall. They outlast empires. They travel across oceans and down through generations, changing shape but never quite disappearing. Somewhere, right now, someone else is lying in the dark, thinking about the past, about the lives that came before, about the streets that were demolished and the people who were displaced, and the worlds that were lost in the name of progress. Maybe they're thinking about Wych Street. Maybe they're thinking about some other vanished place. It doesn't matter. What matters is the thinking, the remembering, the refusal to let the dead be entirely forgotten. That's what stories do. That's why we tell them. Not to bring back what's lost, because nothing brings back what's lost, but to honor it, to acknowledge it, to say, you were here. And that means something, even if nobody else remembers. You were here. Our frightened apprentice was here. Mary was here. Elizabeth and her children, and her grandchildren, were here. Jack Shepherd was here, grinning his way to the gallows. Samuel Johnson was here, defining words that we still use today. The bar wenches and the bookshops, and the buildings that lean together like old friends. All of them, here, once. Gone now, like everything, like everyone, like you and me and everyone who's ever lived, but not forgotten, not entirely, not as long as someone tells the story. Sleep now. The bells of St. Clement Danes are ringing somewhere in your dreams. Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's. The old nursery rhyme, sung by children who never knew what the words meant, passed down through generations who forgot where it came from. The bells are ringing, the fog is lifting, the sun is rising over a London that doesn't exist anymore, a London that only exists now in photographs and stories, and the dreams of people who never saw it. Let the bells carry you down, into the dark, into the quiet, into the rest you've earned. You've walked through history tonight, through streets that vanished a century ago, through lives that ended long before you were born, through a world that was demolished in the name of progress and survives now only in memory. That's a gift. The ability to travel through time without leaving your bed. The ability to live 100 lives in a single night. The ability to know, even briefly, what it felt like to be someone else, somewhere else, somewhen else. Hold on to that gift as you fall asleep. Let it warm you. Let it comfort you. Let it remind you that you're part of something bigger than yourself. A chain of lives stretching back through centuries and forward into futures you'll never see. You're connected to them, the frightened apprentice and the celebrity thief and the barmaid who dreamed of better things. Connected by the simple fact of being human, of being alive, of lying in the dark, wondering about the world. They wondered too, on those hard pallets, in those narrow rooms, listening to the sounds of Wych Street at night. They wondered what their lives meant, whether anyone would remember them, whether the world would be better or worse for their having been in it. We can't answer those questions for them, can't tell them that their neighbourhood would be demolished, their descendants scattered, their names forgotten. Can't tell them that 100 years later, someone would lie in the dark and try to imagine their lives. But we can remember. We can honour. We can tell the stories. That's all any of us can do. For the people who came before, for the people who'll come after, for ourselves, while we're here. Sleep now. Dream of narrow streets and ancient buildings. Dream of a London that was. And when